The Supreme Court is about to do to the Democrats what the asteroid did to the dinosaurs. Total extinction. And Democrats are freaking out because this latest Supreme Court ruling will be their final nail in the coffin. It will condemn the Democrat Party to permanent irrelevancy and ensure that they will never be able to wreak havoc on the American public like they did during Joe Biden's administration. As always, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Make sure you guys watch till the end of this video because this is by far the biggest development of Trump's second term, and I want you guys to be completely informed on this issue. But let's start by hearing what exactly they're ruling on and why it's such a devastating blow to the Democrats.
The Supreme Court is about to hear oral argument in a couple of days in a case out of Louisiana that will literally decide whether the Voting Rights Act remains in good law and remains a protection for minority voting rights, prevents Republicans from redistricting themselves into permanent power in the House of Representatives, or whether the Supreme Court backs away from that, says, you know what, times have changed, no more protection for minority voters, and no constraints on Republicans in the Deep South to engage in absolutely horrific wholesale gerrymandering. This is a 5-alarm fire.
So what they're ruling on is the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This forced states post-Civil Rights Act to create black majority districts to allow black citizens congressional representation, of which they were historically gerrymandered and excluded from. This is why you have districts in Illinois and Louisiana, for example, that are these weird winding districts that cut through the state specifically to include more black voters in congressional districts. These hilariously drawn maps have led to the Democrats being extremely overrepresented in Congress. By not creating reasonable and fair maps based on population, but instead creating these windy and contorted maps with the sole purpose of including as many black residents as possible. This was meant to remedy the historical dilution of the black vote through racially discriminatory maps and replace them with racially preferential ones. And if you're wondering exactly how many extra seats the Democrats have in Congress because of this legislation, listen to this next clip and prepare to have your mind blown.
The districts that have historically been created to protect black voters from, again, being diluted, hither and yon into various districts and losing voting power. Those districts would no longer be protected under federal voting rights law. It could have a swing on the partisan level of 20 or 30 districts. On the black and Hispanic representation level, it would be even more devastating and could have catastrophic effects. So this is really the whole ball game as you look at cases pending before the Supreme Court this term. This is the one to pay attention to. And as I mentioned, Brian and I have talked about this before because this case was argued once before in the Supreme Court. It was argued last term in the Supreme Court, and we expected initially the Supreme Court would give it the back of the hand. Then as the term went along, we got more and more nervous because the Supreme Court hadn't ruled in it. Well, at the end of the term, rather than deciding the case, they scheduled it for rehearing. And that rehearing comes up this week. So please pay attention to this case.
The Democrats are enjoying a 30-seat House advantage due to this legislation, and now the Supreme Court is going to rule on the constitutionality because any law that inherently gives preferential treatment to a group of people based on their race is illegal and unconstitutional. Now, I'm gonna say something that might shock a lot of you, but hear me out. I actually think it was fair and just to implement these reversed racism policies and laws like the Voting Rights Act, like affirmative action, post-Civil Rights Act. You needed the heavy hand of the government to force racism against black people out of institutions, out of laws, out of life, and bring them from unquestionably second-class citizens into the fold as regular citizens with equal rights. In theory, affirmative action makes sense. Black people were historically excluded from job opportunities, thus being restricted in gaining comparable skills to their white counterparts. And black schools were historically neglected, thus leading to black children received a lower quality education to their white counterparts and were unable to qualify and compete on their merits. So yes, you hire a black person who is comparatively less qualified than their white counterpart. But the thinking is, after a few years on the job, they'll develop the requisite skill set to become competent, compete with their white counterparts, and excel on their own merits. And then they'd have better employment, be able to raise their families under better conditions, be able to send their kids to higher quality schools, and voila, the cycle is broken. But baked into that premise is the idea that at some point, these policies will end because the systemic racism will be weeded out through the generations. And that's why it's being heard and ruled on today, because these policies and these laws are no longer necessary. Most reasonable and logical people can point to the election of Barack Obama and say, that's it. That's the end point. Black people have gone from undoubtedly second-class citizens to now being the president of the United States of America. We have officially defeated systemic racism. And I also agree with that. There is no more proof that systemic racism has been defeated than a black man being elected president twice by a majority white country. But the problem with the left and their obsession with identity politics and woke cultural Marxism is they vehemently disagree that the election of Barack Obama signified the end of systemic racism. Woke people believe that systemic racism is ingrained in every facet of society, even the things we don't think about nor would be considered racism. They believe math is racist. They believe going to the gym and striving for a slim, fit, healthy body is racist. They believe things like punctuality, being expected to show up to work on time, articulation, enunciation are all white supremacist concepts. The talent of a woke person is being able to claim victimhood status and pointing to racism or other injustices in every single little tiny thing. And that's the inherent problem with being woke. If in everything you look at, you see racism, discrimination, injustice, you have to, by definition, not see anything good or positive in those things. And that leads to a way of thinking and a group of people who are perpetually miserable, bitter, and resentful. In their mind, white supremacy and systemic racism and injustice can never be conquered without the complete and total destruction and reconstruction of the United States from the ground up. And because in their mind they will always be an oppressed second-class citizen group, they can justify the preservation of laws like the Voting Rights Act and things like DEI affirmative action. But the acceptance of this toxic ideology forces us to never be able to acknowledge the gains that we've made in civil rights and prevent us from finally living as a united people who are all equal to one another. And Democrats promote this toxic ideology, so when the time comes to repeal these no longer necessary laws, they can just scream and cry racism. Let's hear them complain about how this is such an injustice, even though we know they're really mad because they're losing power.
Yeah, so what people need to understand is when we talk about Section 5 and Shelby County, this is the case from 2013 that people were very upset, correctly upset, as gutting a key provision of the Voting Rights Act. That provision applied only to states with histories of discrimination in voting. What it basically said was those states couldn't change their voting laws without getting pre-cleared those changes to make sure they didn't disadvantage minority voters. But there was another provision. And in fact, in Shelby County, the Chief Justice cites this other provision, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, as applying nationwide. And what it does is it prevents vote dilution of minority voters' votes everywhere in the country. And it has particular application in the redistricting context. What it basically does in the redistricting context is says that white legislatures, Republican legislatures, cannot divvy up black voters into a variety of districts and therefore deprive them of their ability to elect candidates of choice, particularly in jurisdictions where that kind of behavior has gone on before. The net effect of that has been that throughout the Deep South, but also, as you point out, not in the Deep South, in states around the country, Native Americans in some places, Hispanics in places like Texas, have been protected from these kinds of vote dilution tactics. Well, if Section 2 is struck down, What it means is that Texas will be able to go back and redistrict again and destroy a bunch of districts where right now Black voters and Hispanic voters are able to elect their candidates of choice.
So to remedy Black people being historically drawn out of maps, they mandated that Black people were drawn in the maps, which I said before was fine for the time. But it has been 4 generations since Black people were second-class citizens. And just because you can point to existing disparities between Black people and white people isn't indicative of discrimination. On average, Korean Americans, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Indian Americans, Nigerian Americans all make more than white Americans. But just because Black Americans remain at the bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy because of Democrat policies, if I might add, the left screams that that's proof of existing systemic racism. America is a melting pot, and there will always be minority racial demographic groups. But to perpetuate laws that give minorities preferential treatment is to perpetuate the same systemic racism that we were trying to eradicate. I think we can all agree there's a middle ground between gerrymandered maps that completely exclude Black representation and creating irregular maps that give Black people arbitrary representation. I don't think any ethnic group should get preferential treatment in congressional representation, let alone anything else. There's a middle ground where maps can be drawn fairly and justly by population, not by ethnic makeup. We are the United States, not the Black states, not the white states, not the Hispanic states. White people are split 50-50 with Democrats and Republicans. Hispanics are 60-40 Democrat. Black people, we know, are 95% Democrat. So this idea that Black people or Hispanic people can't pick the representative of their choice if they're in a district with white people is just completely false. And before you guys say, oh, Brandon, well, this sounds awesome, but it's probably just a pie in the sky pipe dream, here's this next clip where they admit, no, this is likely going to get overturned and the Democrats are cooked.
Mark, the fact that the Supreme Court decided not to rule on this case, not to give it the back of the hand like we expected that they would, and for them, without even being asked by the parties to rule on this particular issue. This was just about 1 seat in Louisiana. And instead, the Supreme Court came forward and said, you know what? In fact, let's just hear a case on the merits of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act altogether. Does the fact that they asked for that without being asked to hear this case, the fact that they did it unto themselves, does that suggest that they may be more inclined to rule against Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act?
Yes. And I wish the answer were no. But, one of the things, Brian, when you and I started doing this series, we made a deal with one another and with you, the members of the audience. We're always going to tell it to you straight. We're not just going to give you the happy news. We're going to give you the straight news. And the truth is, this is not good news.
But what's the range of when we can expect a ruling?
Yeah. So look, I think that there are 2 windows I'd be looking at. Okay. The first is early in the term. So think January or the first week of February. Now, why do I say that's the first window? Because if the Supreme Court wants to rule in time to affect the 2026 elections, it's going to have to issue a ruling in that time window, right?
So the Supreme Court is hearing arguments this week and will likely issue a ruling in January. This will give red states time to redraw their maps ahead of the 2026 midterms and nullify the Democrats' arbitrary 30-seat advantage. And we already know the Democrats have an 8-seat advantage in Congress due to the miscount of the 2020 census. Combine that with the population decline from self-deportations and the mass deportation effort, you're looking at a swing of probably 40 to 50 seats heading into the 2028 elections. I mean, guys, the Democrats are finished here. You're looking at a future where the best case scenario for the Democrat Party in any given election is maybe, possibly, closely tying to Republicans. They'll still be competitive in the Senate, which means they'll still be able to obstruct and stifle in that House of Congress. But what it does mean is going forward, any Democrat legislation will have to pass the House with a significant amount of bipartisanship from Republicans. No longer will they be able to just cram radical, woke, progressive legislation through the House and then pass the Senate. The Democrats have been able to hold an outsized representation of power in the name of social justice. Black people are only 13% of the population, so it's unfair and unreasonable to imply that they should have their own specific set of representation, especially when white people, their supposed oppressors, don't vote at a 95% rate against black people. And in places where there's a lot of black people, there's also a lot of white liberals. So there is no proof to support the claim that black people or Hispanic people being grouped with white people in the same district inherently suppresses their vote due to racism. This is a huge, huge win to the America First agenda and American-loving patriots who are tired of seeing the country dictated, held hostage, and ran by people who hate the country. The Democrats will be forced to return to normalcy and common sense. And if they want to continue to be the party of radical, woke, anti-American ideology, well, they can enjoy permanent irrelevancy as a minority party with no influence. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments section below. This was an awesome one. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Turn on those notification bells so you never miss a video. And I will see you guys in the next one.